Hey everyone, I'm Mike Henry, and this is my Procreate 4.3 demo for the piece I call
You egg-sucking piece of gutter trash!
So you can see here, there's lines that are going to be in the background while I readjust this eye. These were ballpoint pen and Sharpie lines in a sketchbook from a number of years ago. I just always kind of liked this sketch and thought, let's color it up. So that is the only thought I had while working on this was let's take this, bring it to color. Obviously working with the turpentine brush, which by the way there's going to be one more turpentine brush video before we go to something else. So if you're getting sick of it, the wait is almost over. If you dig it, it's coming to an end soon. Although of course you'll see this pop up and everything will sort of intermix as we go forward. But that was all it was this drawing. Let's bring it to color. For years I kind of wanted to, but the idea of just doing like a straight recolor or a straight coloring just didn't seem that interesting, and since I'd been messing around with this brush a lot lately, it was like, okay, cool, let's do that. That'll be a more interesting thing to do with this drawing. Also, fun fact, one of the earliest Procreate pieces I did, which is on this channel if you sort of go all the way back to the beginning, was a Wolverine piece. It was a Wolverine piece with lines, and I did like a warm multiply shadow. That's kind of funny since that's exactly what I did here. It's just, you know, with lots of other techniques involved than what I had done way back then. Also, a long time ago, I did this series of X-Men redesigns, which was tons of fun, and on Wolverine's suit and a couple of the other characters' suit, I used like a dot matrix, like a hex texture, and it just kind of added like this little bit of a texture, almost like the fabric was layered, or there was some sort of, it just added a little more to it, and I do that here as well, just because I thought it'd be a nice throwback. So you could say that this piece is a couple of throwbacks on top of some new stuff, which is just kind of, I guess, some extra fun info there. So here you can see I'm doing what I've done in the last few pieces. I'm just flatting it using the turpentine brush, and you can also see that I adjusted his eye, which is why the lines are like a little darker right there. All that was me, you know, saying like, oh, that should probably scoot in a little this way, that should go that way. There's really nothing much more to say there. It was just a number of years later adjustment where I look at it and say, oh, I kind of wish that was nicer, so I did that. Wolverine is, like a lot of people, a character that I do really enjoy. I have like a specific slice of Wolverine that I like, which is sort of like the late 80s to the early 90s. That's just my sweet spot for liking that character, and then probably ending like shortly after the Uncanny X-Men run that Joe Mad did, because I mean, unfortunately, during part of that run is when Wolverine got like the adamantium pulled out of him, and then he went like all feral and shit, which I thought was just kind of dumb as like a plot and all that kind of stuff. But you know, that 90s cartoon, which we all know wasn't as strong as say like BTAS, but was excellent in its own right, especially with what it was trying to do, having this ongoing narrative that went week over week over week, and bringing those characters into a more digestible, straightforward manner, I always thought was really cool. And now I'm in the process of, my kids are starting to watch that show, and that's also part of what made me, when I saw this old sketch, I was like, okay, let's bring that out, because this particular costume, although it's not my absolute favorite Wolverine costume, I do like that era quite a bit. My favorite is the brown and orange version. There's something about its simplicity, and it's just a little bit more like an animal that I really dig. The reason I'm talking so much about that stuff is because there's really nothing to say about what you're seeing on screen right now. Again, this is just flatting. I could quickly run through the layer stack so that you see what's going on there. So the furthest back layer, which they just turned off, but they'll come back on in a second, is his distant shoulder, then his distant shoulder guard, and then the yellow that makes up a majority of his body and his head. Then the little black strips that go over his shoulders, then his closest shoulder guard, then his like shoulder, his actual skin shoulder that's closest to us, and his face. Then the black from his mask is on top of that, and then in between the black of his mask and his face skin is like all the mouth layers. Oh, I should have mentioned that on the other side, the distant side, or the lowest below in the stack, of his, the yellow part is the back part of his like head fin that sort of curves around his head. Then on top of all of that, and of course his little white eye is on top of the black fin that's closest to us. Then on top of all of that is his fists on a layer, and then his claws are above that. And his claws are also all individually layered, just so that I could really control that, and then they eventually get merged together later on. So now we're just flattening in the mouth. One of the things that I guess I should, earlier I made a joke about there being like not a whole lot of thought that went into this, but there's obviously some thought, because the play of the blue and the yellow against that big field of pink is really fun. At least to me, it's really fun. And I like that it has just this punch and this color that sort of isn't normally associated with Wolverine. And then the only really other thing that I cared about was making the claws look metallic. When I first started the piece, I actually was going to make them that sort of, how do you describe it? It's like this 80s, 90s way of doing like chromed out things where you always sort of put this orange bounce on one side and it gets like really dark in the darks and really bright in the brights, and I wanted to do something like that because I just really like the way that looks, and then sort of in the process I just decided against it, and I instead went for some more just like vague reflections from either him or the surroundings. We'll keep it zoomed in here, even though it's not particularly interesting what's going on with the mouth. It's just, you can get a little bit of detail on what's happening. I'm always looking for opportunities to try and squeeze like a little bit of character in, and so you can see there's like a bit of a gap between his first four incisors and his canine, and that's really just, when I did the original drawing, it was the same thing that I then tried to emphasize in the color, which is just that things aren't perfect, even though he is a superhero of sorts. I like throwing in, like, I mean, it's dental problems basically, right? And there's just something kind of, it adds a lot of, just an extra touch basically to the character. It's not something where you look at those teeth and you go, oh, that must mean that in 1979 he bit into Sabretooth, and it's not that type of thing. It's just something to give a little bit of character there. I mean, that's what we do with people in the real world. That's why we find certain people to have like a quality to them that we think is really fun. So the teeth is just one example. You can do this in lots of different ways, but that's just something that I always think about. A lot of people like to ask me about my mouths and how I draw my mouths, and really I just try to think of them all as these individual components. I think of the big shape, like the big shape that it's making, and I think about, you know, if he's got like a big spiky tooth he needs to have, yeah, okay, there's a big spiky tooth. But then when I'm going in adding the detail, I think about every tooth individually, and I think that that's what makes it so that I just pay more attention to the way those teeth might be layered in there. As for his stubble, I have a penchant for drawing Wolverine stubble as like these almost like quills, like these thick things. I just think it's kind of funny, so that's what I did. Here we've got the 5 o'clock shadow, we've got the quills, we've got a little bit of like a tanning going on. I just think that's kind of, I think of Wolverine that way, that he's like out in the sun all the time. I don't know why. And now we're getting into the shading. So the shading is done with the select paint, select clear method that I talk about in every video. You can see that I'm going through these layers in their order to try and keep the layers clean and keep the process nice and clean as well. We're using warm shadows like we've been doing a lot in recent pieces. It's just been really working, so I kept doing that. When we are done with the turpentine brush pieces, or at least this current run of them, I keep a slightly warm shadow on the next piece after that, really just because it's been feeling good. It's not much different than just using like a purple or a blue shadow, but there's just something about it. Although since I've been looking at a lot of animation lately for the fun of it, I am probably going to start doing just more like gray shadows or like 40% black kind of shadows in some pieces, just to try, you know, toying around with a different look for a little bit. I have to admit, with this piece, I'm sort of struggling to find things to talk about because head-wise, I'm thinking so much about the last thing that I just did that I sort of wrapped up today, which is the Link video that I said I was going to do, where I was going to redesign Link from Zelda, and that's just kind of more on my mind right now. So as I'm looking through this, I'm just like, oh, but I want to talk about that. So there's not a lot to say during this phase. I guess the one thing I will say is that this is sort of doing the form shadows and not the cast shadow. That's the whole point of this pass. But doing it with the turpentine brush and trying not to do any tricks with that, like trying not to smear it or blur it too much or do anything that would take it away from looking like that. You can see here I'm putting the slight little cast shadows that are surrounding each one of those weird attachment things that Wolverine has always had on the backs of his hands. And in a second you're going to start seeing those individual claws get cleared and painted and cleared and painted. Right there you'll see it start now. And that is the reason why I kept all of those layers separate, because I wanted, since they're metal, I wanted to be more precise about their painting. That way they just sort of have a bit of a harder surface look to them, despite the fact that those are some curved surfaces and I am using a very messy brush, so it's got some organic nature to it, but I wanted to do what I could to sort of strengthen that, the more hard surface feel of the whole thing. So now we're going in and doing the cast shadows. This is a very straight on cast shadow, literally like the light is shooting at him, which is causing his claws and his fists to cast onto him. Now, I didn't use any like intense reference for the way that these shadows were going to land on him. It was really more just done by feel, just to say like, okay, this conveys what I'm looking for. But overall, this piece was a bit of a quick hit in between a couple of more heavy pieces. For instance, the Link piece that I was doing, there was a lot of thought going into that, and I was struggling to find time to work on it. So what little time I could was fairly intense. And then I have another piece that's going to come out after this one, and that one is quite involved, and that one between those two pieces I was just completely absorbed, and I just needed something that was kind of light to knock out in between, and that's what this one was supposed to be for me. Okay, now we'll pull in, and so we can get just a little tighter shot of the face and the mouth. That I should mention that the title of this piece is pulled from an episode of the cartoon, if you couldn't figure that out, and I remember that line like sticking with me. I heard that line when it came out on the air. I was obsessed with that show, and I recorded every episode on VHS every time it aired, and I kept them all, and I labeled them all. I was just really into it, and for some reason I'll just never forget that line. And one day I was like play wrestling with my dad or something in the family room. We were just, play fighting type thing, and I remember, I'll never forget that moment. I remember yelling that at him before I like charged him, and it like cracked him up because he just didn't expect. I don't even know how old I was at the time, maybe 10 or something. I can't remember the years. And he lost it on that, and that was just always like really funny. And so that line has always stood out to me as this like absurd thing to yell at someone before you get into a fight. It goes back to that thing that you hear a lot of writers talk about with, while trying to get around the censors, they come up with things that sound like way worse. Like a friend of mine once referred to Jay Leno as a Dorito merchant, and it just sounded so like offensive and somehow like racist, even though it obviously wasn't. And it was just when he was referring to when Jay Leno did like all these Doritos commercials, and it was just so funny to me. And I just love the concept of taking these things that are supposed to be these banal statements, and and they sound like way worse because of because they're out of context. So now we're going through and putting more of the cast shadow on the claws, and once that part is done, we'll move into some extra detailing and then the highlights, and then we go into sort of like a bounce light pass where I'm just going around and making sure that all of the right bounces and reflections and stuff that I want are in there. Kind of funny with Wolverine's claws, I always imagine them having like this flat backing to them, like they're sharp on the part that's facing him right now, and they're like almost flat on the back, but then at the same time I imagine him being able to slash the other way too. They're very strange, actually. I'd love to be a part of like a movie where they're trying to figure out how they're going to do Wolverine's claws. So right there is some extra detailing on the shoulder pads. I like putting a little damage on those parts. That was just done by using the exact same shadow color, but then just adding it in as a separate thing. And now I'm going back into the cast shadow and I'm adding just a little bit of extra detailing there. And now we've jumped to the highlights. So what I was pointing out is that on the form shadow pass, we added in the little divots, and then on the cast shadow pass we added some extra support to those so that they're casting shadow the right way. With the light, this is just a very light blue that has a really lowered opacity, and I am admittedly more I guess flippant or more reckless, let's say reckless, with the lighting, the light layers, because when I'm doing this type of a method, I'm certainly going through and I'm making sure that some of the form is correct, but since those shadow layers are there, I know that I can use those and select them and delete away from the light layers, and that will bring some structure back to the whole thing. So I'm still following some of the forms, but I'm not being as hardcore about it as I would be with the shadows, trying to make sure everything was correct regarding structure. I guess you could say that it's sort of like if you know that you're going to paint something, maybe you don't need to draw in lots of clean, strong lines, but if you know that those paints aren't going to be there and it's going to be more flat colors, and you want more lines in order to support that. It's a similar principle. Since I have these heavy shadows, they're like the lines, so I know that the light can be less painstakingly applied. And since everything is on these sort of master layers, like there's two shadow layers and then there's just the one light layer, it's really easy to select it and clear it away. So here, obviously going much brighter, much richer with the color. It does get a little more desaturated and brightened instead of being so saturated eventually, but the point is to make these claws really pop and to really oversell this like chromed metal look. I do one thing in here that is sort of like against quote unquote the turpentine brush look, which is that bloom right there, which I just did that because the whole piece I started to bring in some more elements that made it feel like it was okay to do some of these other tricks, so different textures and things, and then it's like, okay, well, in order to really sell this, let's make that look like it's bloomy, and then just sort of open the door to doing a few little things like that. That was the pattern that I was talking about. It just got applied to the yellow part, which you'll definitely be able to see in sort of the pan at the end, if you can't see that right now. And then I used the halftone brush for the rim light in the back, which you'll see that change colors and change its opacity a little bit as the piece goes on, but that's the main thing that's being used there, is that halftone brush. Now we're doing the bounce pass. You can see here I'm adding in some bounce of the skin onto his pad, some of the yellow onto also the same pad. We definitely will get to a point where we'll be adding a lot of that into the claws. Right now we're adding some of the yellow bounce onto his glove. You can see right there. And now onto the other glove. Now the background I wanted to have a little bit more energy, so I've now slightly darkened the background, but I used that original brighter pink as a brush now, and I'm painting all over. And I had this idea to sort of do these like almost energy lines, like yelling, or like a graphic drawing attention more to Wolverine kind of thing, but honestly it looked like crap, so I abandoned it, which you'll see me starting to do that in a second. Now this is the reflection pass, where I'm trying to show some of the reflecting that's going on with everything that's around these claws. Now we put in some of the spit that's coming out of his mouth. Tried to make it a little on the graphic side, didn't go for too much realism here. Something I've mentioned in the past is that an influence on me that a lot of people probably don't know about is a surrealist, American surrealist painter named Todd Shore, and you really see it whenever I do like liquid, like spit or something. I'm always channeling him, at least in some way. Here's my bad attempt at that graphic quality. There's things I do in fact like about it, and probably if I would have put a little bit more work into it, it would have been good, but I also think that it kind of ruined some of the flow of the piece, so I end up killing it basically. And I go for more of this like manic energy that's around him that you see right there. And this is actually bringing this piece into the end. So I'll just start wrapping it up right here. There's going to be a couple of little touches, but otherwise that's it. So that there is my Wolverine. I love this character. He sort of is never, I'm never sick of drawing him, but I don't want to overdo it with him. So when I do get the opportunity, I like to try and do something new and fun with him, and I hope you guys dug this as well. And if you did enjoy the video, please consider liking and subscribing. Also, be sure to hit that notification bell, because I've even been experiencing that some of my channels that I subscribe to aren't showing up in the subscription list, which is really weird. I don't know what's going on, but if you care enough, try that. Maybe that'll help solve the problem. No pressure. And if you're looking for me on the internet, these are the places where you can find me.